Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Aishika Bhattacharya and I'll be your moderator for the session. Today we are presenting successful approach for implementing P2P top-down or bottom-up by Pete Lachlan. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. At any point of time, you may send us your questions in the Q&A box and they will be addressed towards the end of the webinar. Introducing Zycus. Zycus is a leading global provider of complete source-to-pay suite of procurement performance solutions. Our comprehensive product portfolio includes applications for both the strategic and the operational aspects of procurement. Zycus has been recognized as a leader in Gartner's Magic Quadrant for strategic sourcing application suites for 3 years in a row. Today we have with us Pete, who has over 2 decades of experience developing and implementing purchase-to-pay strategies for some of the largest companies in the world. He has worked across a range of industries including financial services, IT, health, energy, and manufacturing. He regularly publishes thought leadership pieces in the Purchasing Insight blog and is a sought-after speaker at industry conferences, where he shares his passion for P2P across its whole spectrum, from sourcing and procurement to accounts payable and supply chain finance. Now, without further ado, I will turn the time over to Pete.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and welcome everybody. Thank you all for attending. What is the best approach for implementing purchase-to-pay? A successful purchase-to-pay implementation is much more about change management than it is technology. In many respects, the technology is the easy bit. It's getting people to change that can be more challenging. That's a cliche in many ways, but what does change management actually entail in this context? Well, of course, it involves things like training. It also includes adapting solutions and approaches and policies and processes to meet business requirements. It involves making systems easy to use. And of course, most importantly, it's about persuading people to actually use a system, user adoption. These activities are all very much grassroots activities that happen at an operational level. So it makes sense to use an approach that satisfies the needs of people at the bottom of the hierarchy, users, and work your way up. So that bottom-up approach is actually often used. But how effective is that approach, and what are the problems that will be encountered? Okay. But the first thing I would say is that there is a problem with the bottom-up approach, and that involves what I call the P2P or the purchase-to-pay plateau. It's that kind of limit that you reach where you find it more and more difficult to implement. It can be quite easy with some groups of users to implement P2P, but as you move up in the organisation and across, it can be more challenging. Senior executives and senior managers, I should say, they sometimes see purchase-to-pay and the controls that are involved as frankly above, they see themselves as being above all of that. They see it as unnecessary, an obstacle to them doing their job. Or you may find that within some specialist teams, the purchasing activities are actually very complex, and a standard purchase-to-pay solution simply doesn't meet requirements. So you can reach a limit to how far you can go in an organisation, particularly if you start at the bottom. Let's take some examples. Let's think of the senior manager's perspective. You know, some managers will say, look, this is my business. I'm accountable for the success of this business unit. I don't have the time or the inclination, for that matter, to get involved in tasks like raising purchase orders and those kinds of things. Or they may say, well, look, this is my budget. I fail or succeed on how I choose to make spending decisions. I don't want to use preferred suppliers, for example. It's not an objection that people will say, look, it's my budget, I'm not going to use those preferred suppliers because I can get things cheaper elsewhere. I can get, say, book travel cheaper than on the online system. Or let's look at the example of specialist teams, and my two favourite examples are marketing and legal. So marketing people see themselves as being special and different, and there's a very good reason for that. That's because they are special and different. And in fact, when you speak to most users, everyone is special and different. They all have their own ways of doing things, their own responsibilities, but marketing is particularly different. It's not easy to raise purchase orders for marketing campaigns. How do you raise a purchase order for a large venue, for example? What about a Twitter marketing campaign? How do you do that? The things that marketing people do are very varied and often quite unusual, and it's very difficult for them to comply with a standard set of processes. Legal people are similarly see themselves as being different and special, and it's because they are. They play a very important role, and they may say that it's not the convention within their industry, within the legal profession, it's not the convention to raise purchase orders. And besides, if you're going to employ a firm of lawyers to fight a case for you, you just want them to win. You don't know how much that's going to cost. So how can you raise a purchase order if you don't know costs in advance? So these are the kinds of real challenges that an implementation team will face when they roll out purchase to pay. And one of the most important things that an implementation team needs to have is true empowerment. It's absolutely essential. There are communities within any organization that will want to resist implementing new procurement policies and procurement systems. Unless there is some kind of mandate that empowers the implementation team, it can be very difficult to deal with some groups of people. For senior managers, for example, if you're an implementation team and you're trying to persuade people several rungs up the ladder from you, people higher in the organizational hierarchy than you, you have to have some very persuasive arguments in order to persuade those people, it could be your boss, to change your modus operandi. And if those arguments fail, and they will sometimes, you need something to fall back on. And that needs to be a mandate from their boss. It's really important. Similarly with specialist teams, the challenges that specialist teams face are absolutely genuine. The situation I described with marketing and legal, they're absolutely genuine problems that need to be overcome. But the discussion with those teams should not be about if you're going to implement. It needs to be how you're going to implement. You need to all recognise that you have to overcome these challenges and start from a point of view of the implementation being non-negotiable. That requires empowerment from the top. Banks are a very interesting organisation. I've had experience myself, and anyone else who's experienced work implementing purchase to pay in a bank will be very familiar with this. There are some people in banks who, will earn the bank millions or even billions of dollars if they're based on trading and things like that. And some of the people that you'd be talking to, trying to persuade to change the way they do things, they could be very, very highly paid people. You imagine the conversation you have with someone who's paid £500,000 bonus, and you try and persuade them that they need to travel economy. It just doesn't happen. The only way you can persuade people to change out of their comfort zone is for their bosses to tell them that they need to change. Similarly, global businesses. If you're implementing in a global business, what actually happens is usually the country business is an entirely autonomous legal entity. They really are literally their own separate business who has a relationship with the head office or the group in some way. it's very difficult to persuade those businesses to change their ways, and the only way of doing it is to make it a requirement that's mandated from the top. So empowerment is absolutely critical. It's not just about empowerment. Leaders need to lead by example. Even if there is a mandate in place, senior staff absolutely need to be seen to be complying with policy. If you have senior people seeing themselves as above the process and flouting the rules and ignoring policy, then the people beneath them will follow suit. So it's very, very important not only to get empowerment and buy-in at a very senior level, that has to be put into practice also. And finally, when the implementation team faces some kind of confrontation, faces a team, let's say the specialist team that really doesn't want to change, even for genuine reasons, it's really important to recognise that the implementation team's most important, most powerful weapon is silence. People generally want to behave as good corporate citizens. They want to comply, but often they just can't see how to comply. And it's very important that the implementation team listens to business requirements in order to effectively put mandates in place and make sure that the business requirements are satisfied. Okay, I want to change tack a little bit. I've talked so far about the importance of empowerment and the importance of buy-in from the top that can filter down and make a P2P implementation team more easy. But I'd like to look at things in a slightly different way. Now, imagine that this is you, the one on the right, I mean. You're a prisoner and you're being interrogated. And you've committed a crime. And you're being interrogated by the police, and the police offer you a deal. They say that if you grass on your partner, you've done this crime with a partner, if you drop your partner in it and say that they did the crime, then you will be allowed to go free. The converse can happen as well, of course. Your partner could drop you in it, and you could end up going to prison and they go free. If you both drop each other in it, you'll go to prison. But if you both remain silent, you'll get away with a much lesser sentence. And many of you will be absolutely familiar with what I'm talking about, which is the prisoner's dilemma, which is an example of game theory. So if you think about that deal that the police are offering, there are 4 possible outcomes. You have prisoner A, prisoner B, and they could either be silent or they could talk. And these 4 outcomes are described. So if they both talk, they get sent to prison. If only one talks, one goes to prison, perhaps with a heavier penalty. And if they both remain silent, the police will find somebody else to charge them on. They'll get a short sentence. Now, if that's you, think about how you would behave. You don't want to go to prison. The only way you're not going to go to prison is to grass on your partner. And in fact, the game theory suggests that in all cases, both prisoners will talk. Even though the optimal outcome for both of them is to remain silent, that won't happen because they don't want to risk being sent to prison for 5 years. And that is an inevitable consequence of the rules of the game. Okay, it's rather a contrived example, but it's just an example of how the rules of the game will determine particular outcomes that are not necessarily desirable. So real world examples of this. The arms race is the most quoted example of where game theory was used to plan military strategies and so on. And what happened in the middle of the Cold War, we had the least optimal outcome of the rules of the game, in that both sides stockpiled so many nuclear weapons they could destroy the world many times over. That's clearly not an optimal outcome, but it was an inevitable consequence of the rules of the game. Doping in sport, there are many people that think it's inevitable that in some sports there will sports people will take performance-enhancing drugs. The thinking there is that people at the top of their game, they only need a slight advantage to make a big difference. And they feel that if they're competing with others who they suspect are taking performance-enhancing drugs, they need to do the same. And it becomes an inevitable consequence of the rules of the game that drug taking will happen. Supply chain finance. Not just supply chain finance, but when I say supply chain finance in this context, I'm thinking of the kind of financial transactions within a supply chain. There are opposing drivers between buyers and suppliers. It's in the interest of buyers to hold on to their cash and to pay suppliers late. But if they do that, suppliers have to borrow more money to cover their costs, and as a consequence, prices go up. And as time goes by, payment terms get extended further and further, and prices get higher and higher, and you end up with the consequence of higher prices, which and higher costs, which is not the optimal outcome for anyone in the supply chain. It makes much more sense to have prompter payments and lower prices. But it's a consequence of the rules of the game that will always happen. And also, it's relevant to purchase to pay. There are different parts of the organisation that have opposing priorities, and it can create a dysfunctional organisation, a suboptimal outcome because of the way businesses work, the way they structure. It becomes an inevitable consequence that they will be dysfunctional. And I'll give some examples of this. But let's think of how many organisations are structured, and what might cause this kind of behaviour or contribute to this kind of behaviour. So when you think of many organisations, they operate in very distinct and separate functional silos. So I've got an example of a generic business here with 5 silos: HR, finance, procurement, marketing, and product development. And this diagram is supposed to represent how they're structured. They're joined at the top, at the board level, but beneath them, at an operational level, they are quite separate. And when it comes to communication, the communication is very effective at the top level. Board members speak to each other on a very regular basis, often have very good relationships with one another. But communication on an operational level, when the silos are very clearly, are very strong, communication doesn't happen across those silos. And so the only way to get communication to happen is at the top. And this makes it extremely inefficient. Let me give you one example of this. And many of you will be familiar with this. Often people talk about a poor relationship between finance and procurement. And this is often the case because finance and procurement operate in completely different silos. Often, the only times they ever communicate is when there's a problem. So, for example, an invoice comes in that didn't have a purchase order. So finance will send the invoice to procurement to say, what's this about? Because nobody knows, and it goes backwards. It can go backwards and forwards. And it's not a healthy conversation. It's really passing problems on to one another. If the only time you ever communicate is to give each other problems, then it's natural that relationships aren't necessarily going to be positive. This creates a dysfunctional organisation. And I would say that in that functionally siloed organisation, P2P simply, it just doesn't work. It can never work. So I promised you some examples. Let's think of an example, the kinds of things that can happen in an organisation where finance and procurement don't talk to each other. Negotiation of contract terms. And I have to say these are real life examples. A buyer might want to negotiate special payment terms with the supplier. The supplier may say, yes, we can absolutely offer you this product or service at this price if you can pay us in 7 days. And I've seen examples of this where that's negotiated and that's agreed. The moment the contract is signed, there is a problem because procurement hasn't spoken to AP about whether it's practically possible to pay in 7 days. And immediately you're in breach of contract. The moment the contract's signed and the moment you start doing business, you're in breach of the contract because you promised something that you couldn't do. Why does that happen? That happens because accounts payable is very rarely part of the sourcing conversation where the P2P ground rules are established with suppliers. GRNI is another good example. GRNI is a very important metric for finance, very important. But you ask most procurement people what is GRNI, they won't know and they don't want to know because it's a finance thing. It's absolutely nothing to do with them. But to manage GRNI, that's goods received, not invoices, to manage it and to minimise it, cooperation from procurement is absolutely required. But if there isn't a collaborative environment, there isn't already a collaborative relationship where they both see this as being in the corporate good, then it's very difficult to manage GRNI. Procurement don't see it on their KPI dashboard. Yes, finance are asking them to invest time in helping to manage it. Coding of transactions. Again, this is a very common situation where accounts payable will say, if we implement purchase to pay, we'll be able to cut our operational costs by 50%, let's say. We can reduce the size of our AP team very significantly. If all of the purchase orders are properly coded with GL codes, cost centers, and all of these kinds of things on a purchase order, then all the coding happens automatically and we can automate everything. It all sounds great. But the procurement community could say, well, our job is just to make sure we get things on time, get things for the business to run on time. We don't want to have to do finance job and put all of these GL codes on. We don't really understand what they are, we don't understand the combinations that are valid. You know, this is a finance thing. And there'll be this friction between the two. Procurement saying that's finance's job and finance saying, well, we could save huge efficiencies if you do that. But there is actually an answer to that dilemma, which is to implement a good automated P2P system. But it is a very good example of how organisations can become dysfunctional because finance and procurement don't collaborate as a matter of course. And I think the best example I know of how dysfunctional an organisation can be is management of DPO, days payable outstanding. So DPO is the measure of how long it takes to pay suppliers. And if the DPO is a high number, that's good from a finance point of view. If it's a low figure, that's bad. A high DPO means that you take a long time to pay suppliers. It means that you hold on to your cash for longer. In some organisations, there's often a drive to increase DPO. It could be towards the end of a quarter or the end of a financial year. I've seen organisations that say, don't pay suppliers in the last month of the financial year, just don't pay them, because that way we can optimise our DPO figure. From a finance and accounting point of view, that seems like a sensible thing to do, but from a supply chain point of view, that could be an absolute disaster. And again, I have seen examples, and this is not unusual, where suppliers will put the customer on hold because of lack of payment of an invoice. A direct consequence of aggressively managing DPO can mean severe supply chain disruption, which can mean the core business can collapse. It makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. You're successful on one side of the business, but at a severe cost to another part of the business if they don't talk, don't collaborate. So in functionally siloed organisations, P2P simply doesn't work. So how do you overcome that? The way to overcome the problem problem of silos is, from a P2P point of view, act like a matrix managed organization. A matrix managed organization is where typically you will have, you may still have silos, but you have vertical silos and horizontal silos. And the horizontal silos open up the communication at an operational level. So, for example, you have finance and procurement. People in finance report to their finance people, but they also have a responsibility to silos, probably not a good word for this, but a horizontal, a horizontal silo called P2P. They have two responsibilities here. Responsibility to finance, so things like managing DPO, but also a responsibility and an accountability for successful purchase to pay, which means looking at the consequences of aggressive management of DPO and looking to see if there's any supply chain disruption. Similarly, people in procurement, they have to manage their procurement KPIs, which is about making sure the right goods arrive on time at the right price and all of those kinds of things. But they also have a responsibility to P2P, which also includes some financial metrics as well. And in this way, you can have, you remove that dysfunctional behavior between finance and procurement. How do you set up a matrix type structure in an organization between finance and procurement? The only way of doing that is with the agreement and, again, empowerment right at the top of the board level. So the finance director and procurement director have to enable this and support it. So there's a second reason why a top-down approach is extremely important for successful implementation. So a third reason, costs. I describe this as costs in one bucket, sorry for the typo there, costs in one bucket, benefits in another. This is quite a common situation where the benefit of a P2P resides in one part of an organisation, yet it's another part of the organisation that needs to cover the costs. Now let me give you an example of this. Supposing that an organisation is going to implement P2P as a result of an audit. So the auditors have come in and they've said, you know, there are holes in your purchase to pay process. You run the risk of fraud if you don't put controls in place. You need to have a proper end-to-end purchase to pay system. And that's actually a very good rationale for implementing purchase to pay. It's often the reason why, that's often the dominant reason why purchase to pay is implemented. But if the procurement director is asked to solve that problem and use procurement budget and procurement resource to implement purchase to pay, they don't see a direct benefit from that. You know, the risk of fraud isn't on a procurement KPI dashboard. There's certainly a corporate benefit for it, but it's not within the direct responsibility of the procurement director. So in that case, we have the costs in one part of the organisation, which is procurement, but the benefits sit somewhere else. Similarly, the example I described before of finance. Finance can make, or accounts payable, can make huge efficiency savings if all of the accounting is done up front. If all of the purchase orders contain all of the accounting information, then the cost, the operational cost of accounts payable is much lower. But again, what we're talking here about potentially procurement having to incur the cost and finance to earn all of the benefits. And these are two very good examples of where the costs and the benefits are in different buckets. Now, a key part of the beginning of any implementation is to build a business case which compares costs and benefits. And if those costs and benefits are in entirely different places, then it's very difficult to build that compelling case. The only way of resolving what is a very common situation is to take the business case at a corporate level and start and make some decisions right at the top about how to distribute costs and how to recognise benefits. So it's in the interests of procurement to take the AP savings. It's somehow recognised that their efforts get some reward and they get that recognised. So that's the only way of doing that. So again, it's another example of how when we compare bottom up and top down, it's very convincing that a top down approach in this case is very powerful. Okay, so I'd just like to, before we go to any questions, and we're probably a little bit ahead of time, so there may be an opportunity to have some questions. I just want to summarise. The question is, which is the optimum implementation approach? Is it bottom up or is it top down? From a change management point of view, although the biggest challenge to P2P is change management, it's very difficult to be effective in this respect unless you get sponsorship and buy-in directly from the very top of an organisation. Communication and collaboration. I've described how in many organisations, communication at an operational level across the functional silos, particularly finance and procurement, can create a dysfunctional organisation. And the only way to break these barriers down is with influence direct from the top of the organisation. Thirdly, a holistic approach is required. The benefits of P2P spread across many parts of the organisation, certainly across procurement and finance, and there are benefits at a corporate level. There are good corporate reasons to implement purchase to pay that's difficult to allocate to either procurement, finance or IT for that matter. The only way of justifying that sometimes is to take that holistic approach and take a view from the very top. So I'll make a final comment in terms of, the question is top, down or bottom up. I would say in nearly all cases, for most organisations, a top-down approach to purchase to pay is easily the most effective. Okay, as I say, we were a little bit ahead of time, not too far ahead, but we certainly have time for some questions. I'm aware that I've gone through quite a lot of, covered quite a lot there, gone into some depth in some areas, but I'd certainly welcome any questions that you have.
Okay, so Pete, we have a couple of questions from the audience. The first question is, in your examples, you mentioned that a senior manager can get products and services cheaper elsewhere. How do you answer that?
Yeah, this is a very common objection. A good example of this is travel. As part of a purchase to pay system, often you might include a specialist travel module that will be able to book hotels, flights, trains, things like that. And it's not unusual to be able to shop around on the internet and find prices cheaper. Now, this is seen as both we see this as both a genuine objection and a false objection. The difference between those two, a genuine objection is a real reason not to be able to follow policy. A fake objection is where someone simply doesn't want to comply and wants to find a justifiable excuse, if you like. However, comparing prices is not an accurate way of looking at this as an issue. It's not the price the price that's important, it's the cost. So for example, when you compare, say, the cost of a hotel, your purchase to pay system says you can have a hotel room for $150, yet you can go online and you can find the same room apparently for $125. It could be that the booking conditions are quite different. So for example, the $125 could be payment up front and no refund if you don't turn up. Whereas the $150 could be you can cancel at any time. Well, that's very common, and I would be willing to bet that the person that says, I'm not going to comply because I can buy the room for $125, you can bet that if they do have to cancel their trip, they'll still claim the $125 on expenses. So it actually becomes more costly to book in a non-compliant way than the compliant way, and it's often quite difficult to it's quite easy to overcome this as an objection. So it's seen as a valid objection sometimes, where people say, yeah, but I can get it cheaper and it's my budget, but you actually have to compare costs rather than just price. We should also remember that the cost of buying isn't just about the price that's paid, it's the cost of processing the transaction. So for example, if somebody fails to comply and buys something that is cheaper than available on a P2P catalogue, they're often not factored in the cost of AP having to process an invoice for which there was no purchase order. So it's a very common objection, but the approach to overcome that is to say, well, let's not compare prices, let's compare costs. I hope that answers the question. Oh, there's another question I can see here, actually, from Ian Connor. In your experience, is it possible to make a convincing case for investing in P2P that the CFO will accept? I like this question. I think this question alludes to a situation that's very important. Purchase to pay looks very different depending on whether you look at it from a procurement perspective or whether you look at it from a finance perspective. If, for example, you think of, and often when people say P2P, they often actually mean either P2 or 2P. What do I mean by that? P2 is actually e-procurement, just the procurement end of purchase to pay, and 2P is sometimes just the accounts payable end of purchase to pay. It's just, now, can you make a convincing argument as a CFO of the 2P? Absolutely yes, because if you can automate your AP, you reduce your operational costs very significantly. But can you create a convincing business case from a procurement perspective that the CFO will accept? Absolutely you can, because the operational costs, well, there are two main savings. The operational cost in an organisation is much lower with P2P, but the price paid for goods and services should also be less because there's less maverick behaviour. And if you combine those two business benefits, reduce cost of operation and reduce prices, you can make a bottom line saving that any CFO will buy into. There is one exception, however. If you have an organisation that has no processes at all, and you implement P2P, you may actually have to staff up to implement P2P. You might have to employ more staff. That could be seen as a problem. You know, we don't want the cost of expensive processes. But without purchase to pay processes, there is a huge hidden risk of losing a lot of money, particularly through fraud. It can be difficult to quantify, but I would suggest any CFO that thought it was better to have a completely uncontrolled environment rather than a very tightly controlled environment, albeit at a cost. It would be that would be a very dangerous position to take. I can see another question, again from Ian. How do you combat arguments that we don't need a P2P solution? We have an ERP and that meets our needs. I'm suspecting that Ian is speaking from experience here. because it very much depends on what ERP you have. I can think of lots of examples where people might say this, but where I have been able to combat these arguments by looking at the user-friendly nature of an ERP system. ERP systems are, generally speaking, not user-friendly unless you're using them all the time for your core job. For somebody who buys indirect goods, let's say stationery, for example, occasionally having to use the ERP system itself in order to do that can be painful. It can be so painful that you ignore the policy and you just go and buy things with a credit card and claim them on expenses. One of the big benefits of P2P systems, particularly if we're talking about e-procurement and typical cloud-based solutions that are available today, is that the user-friendly nature of them. The challenge of P2P is to get user adoption, make it easy, make it the easiest compliant way to buy. And in order to do that, you usually need a specialist tool which can link to the ERP rather than be the ERP itself.
Okay, Pete, we have one more question from the audience from Vigdesh. The question is, from a program point of view, top-down is the workable approach, but from benefit realization point of view, once the program is kicked off, how do we measure it, top-down or bottom-up? Because the operations decide the benefit of the tool delivered to them.
Okay, I want to. Okay, let me just think that through. So, from a program point of view, top-down is a workable approach, as I've argued, yes. But the benefit realization point of view, once the program's kicked off, how do we measure that, top-down or bottom-up? Because the operations cost decides the benefit. Okay. I'm going to try and answer that as I understand the question. I hope I understand the question the way it's been asked. But yes, certainly I think that the question is confirming that the implementation approach is best done in a top-down way. How do you measure benefits? The real benefits and the real justification for the purchase to pay is all to do with operational cost. Also operational cost and prices that are paid. It is a result of compliant behaviour that people more often buy within contract, so less money is spent on goods and services. So that, and fewer people having to manage the end-to-end purchase to pay process. Now, those metrics are absolutely in the interests of, at board level, they have bottom line impact. So certainly, I would say that the measures are something that are in the interests of people at the top. However, from a practical point of view, building a purchase to pay and managing a purchase to pay dashboard, KPI dashboard, I should say, is something that is absolutely should be one of the day-to-day occupations of people at an operational level. And they should absolutely be incentivized on making sure that those KPIs are optimized and continually improve. So from that point of view, I think that the measurement of benefits is absolutely at an operational level, at a low level. I wonder if you could, I'm not sure if you call that bottom up, but I think that is the different dynamic. You know, we don't need drivers from the board to manage KPIs. That's something that is at an operational level. So I hope I'm understanding the question, and I hope that answers it satisfactorily as well.
All right. Thank you so much, Pete. We would like to thank all the audience for joining us for today's session. I would like to remind everyone that we'll be sending the recording of this webinar along with the presentation that Pete presented today to all of you within the next 2 days. And if you have any questions or any doubts, you can always reach out to us. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.